The fire crackled low in the hearth of the small cottage where Hester sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the frost blooming across the window pane. It had been years since she allowed herself to speak of it. Decades, in fact. But tonight, something in the wind stirred the past like ash, and the silence she'd kept so long began to dissolve. They had all gone now. Mrs. Furnivall, Miss Stark, the little Lady Rosamond, buried in churchyards whose stones had softened with moss and time. Yet the house still stood. Hester had been young when it happened, barely 19, her apron barely creased, her voice still gentle from the home she left behind. She had been chosen to care for Miss Rosamond, a child not more than 4, whose parents had both been taken by consumption before winter settled fully over the countryside. The girl had golden curls and eyes that blinked at the world with innocent wonder, unaware of the grief clinging to her black frock. It was decided that Rosamond should be sent to her distant relatives in Northumberland. Her only surviving kin, Miss Grace Furnivall, an elderly spinster of dignified bearing and quiet sadness, lived at Furnivall Manor, a grand, crumbling estate nestled deep within the snowy fells. Hester was to go with her, not just as a nurse but as a witness to the child's early years, and perhaps, though she did not yet know it, to something far older. The journey north had been long, the air sharpening with every mile. Snow fell in broad, muffling sheets, and the carriage creaked with the weight of silence. When they arrived at the gates of Furnivall Manor, dusk had already darkened the sky to slate. The house loomed above them, gray stone spires etched against the clouds, window panes catching the faint glow of lantern light. Mrs. Stark received them at the door, a woman of tight-lipped composure, her hair bound severely, her eyes sharp as flint. She did not smile, but neither did she scowl. She merely gestured them inside, where the great hall stretched out, shadowy and vast. The portraits lining the walls seemed to watch their arrival with a cold detachment, though Hester noticed several gaps where frames might once have hung. Miss Furnivall descended the stairs slowly, her figure thin, her skin pale like old parchment. Yet her eyes, sharp and distant, seemed to soften when they settled on Rosamond. "She favors her mother," she said softly, and nothing more. Hester made the nursery warm and comfortable. She laid out Rosamond's toys, the little cloth dolls and wooden animals her father had carved. The child settled quickly, too young to grieve with understanding, but quieted by Hester's presence. The routine of care unfolded gently, mornings with porridge and play, afternoons by the fire with picture books. Outside, the snow thickened. No visitors came. No laughter echoed down the halls. It was in the second week that Hester first heard it. She had been walking the corridor near the west wing when the sound stopped her in her tracks. Organ music, distant, trembling, notes pressed with reverence and sorrow. She stood still, heart beating loud against her ribs. The sound drifted from the great hall, and yet when she descended the stairs, the keys sat untouched beneath their velvet cover. She asked Mrs. Stark about it. "There's no one to play the organ, nurse," the housekeeper said, her tone clipped. "Miss Furnivall's hearing is not what it once was. Perhaps you imagined it." But Hester had not imagined it. That night, and several after, she heard the music again, always at dusk, always stopping the moment she came close. The servants, few as they were, spoke little. There was Agnes, the scullery maid, who kept her head down. The gardener, a sallow man who rarely came indoors. No one offered stories. No one offered smiles. The house was beautiful, but not warm. Its ceilings stretched too high, its silence too absolute. Hester felt it pressing inward, as though the walls held breath they refused to release. One evening, Rosamond tugged Hester's sleeve. "Who's the little girl outside?" she asked. Hester frowned. "What little girl, my love?" "The one with no shoes," Rosamond said matter-of-factly. "She wanted to come inside, but she said I had to open the door for her." Hester's stomach turned. "Rosamond," she said gently, "there's no little girl outside. You must have been dreaming." But the child insisted. She was real. She cried because it was cold. Hester went to the window. Snow blanketed the ground untouched. No footprints. No sign of life. Still, she double-checked the locks on every door. That night, the music returned, heavier now, louder. Hester stood at the nursery door, listening. It rose and fell like a hymn, old and mournful. Rosamond stirred in her bed but did not wake. Hester's hand trembled as she reached for the candlestick, her eyes drawn towards the stair. The next morning, she found snow melted on the inside of the kitchen threshold. She said nothing. The housekeeper grew colder with each passing day. Miss Furnivall, who rarely left her armchair, began to murmur things under her breath, names Hester didn't recognize. One afternoon, Hester caught her whispering by the fire, hands wringing the embroidered kerchief in her lap. She only wanted forgiveness, the old woman muttered, but it was too late, too late. The wind howled that evening, rattling the windows like hands against the glass. Rosamond woke crying. "She was here," she whispered. "She was looking for me." Hester held her close. "Who?" "Darling, the little girl. She said she had to show me something, but I told her no. I told her you said not to." And Hester, heart pounding, stroked the child's hair and did not reply. Because what could she say? The truth had begun to press in at the edges, and the house, Furnivall Manor, was not finished with them. Not yet. The next morning, Hester rose before the sun. A thick hush lay over Furnivall Manor, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The previous night still clung to her, its echoes refusing to fade. Rosamond slept soundly now, a small angel tangled in quilts, but Hester's nerves were raw. She moved quietly, lighting the nursery fire, and stepped out into the hallway. A fresh layer of snow had fallen. She knew this without opening a window. She could feel it in the stillness, in the dull light filtering through the glass. She descended the stairs, footsteps muffled by worn carpet, and entered the kitchen. Agnes was there already, silent as always, her face pale in the firelight. "Did you hear anything strange last night?" Hester asked cautiously. Agnes shook her head without looking up. "Just the wind, miss." Hester didn't press her, but as she turned away, she noticed the door again, the same one she'd found wet beneath the threshold. The wooden floor showed no new moisture, no snow, and yet she swore she'd seen melted footprints. She told herself it was the draft, a trick of shadows. She had to believe that. Later that day, she walked Rosamond around the gallery. The child skipped and hummed, seemingly untouched by the strange moods of the house. Her joy brought color to the gloom. They passed a covered frame. Rosamond stopped. "Who's that supposed to be?" The curtain had slipped just enough to reveal a corner of paint, a woman's hand, pale against a dark dress, resting on the head of a small child. "Don't touch that," Hester said quickly, pulling Rosamond back. "Let's go to the library." She glanced down the hallway. No one had seen, but the moment unsettled her. Why was that portrait hidden? Who was it? That evening, the wind returned. The organ played. It was louder this time, closer, almost weeping. Hester stood outside the great hall, holding her breath. The music swelled, trembled, then stopped all at once. She stepped inside. The organ was as always, closed, cold, untouched. She looked up at the gallery above. Empty. A creak behind her. She turned, heart thudding, but the door was shut. No one there. She returned to the nursery, where Rosamond was already asleep. Yet the child stirred restlessly, murmuring in dreams. Hester sat by her side all night. In the days that followed, the house grew colder, not from the weather alone, but from something underneath. Miss Furnivall's fits of muttering became more frequent. She sat staring at the fire, lips moving, sometimes gasping aloud as though reliving something she could no longer bury. Mrs. Stark, in contrast, grew harder. Her footsteps snapped across the stone like gunshots. She began inspecting the nursery at odd hours, scolding Agnes for imagined slights, and glaring at Hester as though blaming her for something that had not yet happened. Then, one afternoon, Rosamond disappeared. Hester had left her for no more than 10 minutes, just to fetch a book from the library. When she returned, the nursery was empty. Her breath caught in her throat. She ran through the halls, calling, panic rising with each unanswered cry. Down the stairs, past the kitchen, out into the snow-covered garden. And there, near the edge of the forest, she saw her. A tiny figure in a red cloak, far too small to be alone. Hester sprinted, boots crunching through the snow, lungs burning. Rosamond stood still, facing a thin, half-bare tree. Next to her was another child, pale, barefoot, dressed in a faded white gown. The second girl turned to look at Hester and vanished. Hester grabbed Rosamond, who seemed dazed. "She told me to come," the child whispered. "She said I could see where she sleeps." Hester scooped her up and hurried back inside. That night, she said nothing to the others. She bundled Rosamond in warm blankets and lay beside her until the girl drifted off. In the morning, she confronted Mrs. Stark. "There's something wrong in this house." Mrs. Stark's mouth became a line. "Don't be foolish." "I saw a child," Hester said. "In the snow, with Rosamond, and I've heard the organ. I know someone plays it." Mrs. Stark's expression remained flat, but her eyes flashed with something between fear and contempt. "You'll speak no more of this," she said sharply. "There are things better left untouched. You're a nurse, not a priest." She turned and walked away. That evening, Miss Furnivall collapsed. It happened by the fireplace. One moment she was whispering, the next she screamed. Hester ran to her side as Mrs. Stark rushed in, kneeling beside the old woman. "She was at the window," Miss Furnivall gasped. "The snow. She was crying. She was crying again." Mrs. Stark gripped her shoulders. "Grace, hush, it was nothing." Miss Furnivall sobbed. "Don't let her in. Please, not again." That night, Hester did not sleep. She sat by the window, eyes on the forest. The snow fell gently. At midnight, the organ played again. This time, it did not stop. She rose and walked the corridor slowly. The music surrounded her, aching, beautiful, wrong. She passed the covered portrait again. This time, she pulled back the curtain. It was the woman she'd glimpsed before, young, proud, sorrowful. At her feet sat a child. The face was Rosamond's. No, not Rosamond, but so like her it chilled the blood. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned. Nothing. Only the silence after song. The days that followed blurred into one long, drawn-out silence. Furnivall Manor had never felt warm, but now it seemed to exhale frost from the very walls. The fires sputtered, though they were fed. The candles burned low even when fresh, and every shadow grew teeth. Hester stayed close to Rosamond. The child had grown quiet, not sullen, but contemplative, like a small soul carrying a secret. She no longer asked about the barefoot girl, but neither did she forget. At night, she sometimes stirred, whispering phrases that made Hester shudder. "She's waiting again," or "She cried so loud beneath the tree." And still, the music continued, always at dusk, or when the moonlight turned the great hall silver. The organ's notes spilled like grief through the corridors. Hester stopped trying to follow the sound. It had no source. It lived in the bones of the manor itself. One evening, while Rosamond napped, Hester found herself drawn to the upper galleries. Her feet moved as if pulled. She walked past shuttered rooms and tarnished sconces until she reached a door she hadn't noticed before. It was small, nearly hidden by the curve of the stairwell. She tried the handle. Locked. As she turned to leave, she heard it. Soft, distinct footsteps from the other side. She froze. The steps paused, then a whisper. Not words, just breath and sorrow. She backed away slowly and didn't return that way again. That night, Miss Furnivall called out from her room. Hester and Mrs. Stark rushed in. The old woman sat upright in bed, eyes wild. "She's here," she rasped. "In the snow. Just like before, I heard her cry." Mrs. Stark pressed a cloth to her forehead. "It's the fever," she said, her voice a shade too calm. "She's not well." But Hester had seen the old woman's eyes. They weren't fevered, they were haunted. Later, downstairs, she confronted Mrs. Stark again. "You know who the child is, don't you?" Mrs. Stark turned from the fire. "This house is old. It remembers things." "That's not an answer." The housekeeper's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea neither of them drank. "There was another daughter," she said at last, her voice thin. "A long time ago, before Miss Grace took her vows of silence." "A daughter?" Mrs. Stark nodded. "Maud. She was not legitimate, but she bore the Furnivall name." Hester felt her heart quicken. What happened to her? Mrs. Stark set the teapot down. "No one speaks of it." "But she had a child, didn't she?" Hester said slowly. "That's who's appearing to Rosamond. That's who's playing the organ." Mrs. Stark looked up sharply, and for the first time, something cracked in her expression. Fear. "Some things," she whispered, "must remain buried." But Hester had heard enough. She understood now that the house wasn't haunted by strangers. It was grieving its own sins. That same night, Rosamond vanished again. Hester had left her only for a moment to stoke the fire in the next room. When she returned, the nursery door stood open. The wind howled down the corridor. She ran, calling Rosamond's name, panic clawing at her throat. Down the stairs, through the hall, out into the blizzard. And there, at the edge of the trees, she saw her. Rosamond stood barefoot in the snow, pale as bone, her little red cloak fluttering behind her. The other girl stood beside her again, and this time she was holding Rosamond's hand. Hester sprinted, stumbling through the drifts. "Rosamond!" she screamed. The wind roared. Snow blinded her. When she reached them, the ghost vanished again, like a breath blown out. Rosamond sobbed against her chest. "She was taking me to her mother," the child wept. "She said I had to see." Hester carried her back inside, shaking, soaked through, heart hammering. She locked every door. She burned every candle. And when Miss Furnivall saw them, her face turned gray. "You saw her?" the old woman said. Hester nodded. "Rosamond did, twice now, and I think she'll keep coming back." Miss Furnivall closed her eyes. "I made her promise to stay away," she whispered. "But she's a child. She wants a friend." "Who is she?" Hester asked. But Miss Furnivall only said, "She was left to die." After she left, Hester returned to the covered portrait in the gallery. This time, she ripped the curtain down. It was Maud, younger than Miss Furnivall, but with the same high cheekbones, the same proud tilt of the chin. She was beautiful, and beside her stood the child. Hester studied the eyes. They were Rosamond's. But this girl's face was thinner, more fragile. There was no joy in it, only silence. She descended to the great hall, heart thudding. The organ stood before her like a tomb, and then it began to play, keys pressing down, one by one, though no hands touched them. Hester stepped forward. The music swelled. She placed a hand on the wood, and the sound stopped. Behind her, the door creaked open. Miss Furnivall stood there, wrapped in a shawl, shaking. "She waits for absolution," the old woman whispered. "For what?" Hester demanded. "What did you do?" The wind howled through the cracks in the stained glass. Miss Furnivall stepped forward. "She loved beneath her station. My father forbade it. When we found she was with child, he ordered the baby removed. Maud refused. She was cast out." Her voice broke. She wandered in the snow. The child died. She died. No grave, no prayer. Hester stared at her, horrified. "And you let it happen." Miss Furnivall nodded slowly. "I was afraid." The organ let out one last groan, as if in mourning. Upstairs, Rosamond stirred in her sleep. The girl would come again. Hester knew it. But this time she would be waiting. That night, the wind didn't just howl, it spoke. At least, that's how it felt to Hester, who sat awake in the dim nursery while Rosamond slept under layers of wool and fire-warmed air. The draft under the door had taken on a life of its own, curling like breath across the wooden floorboards, as if the house itself were sighing. From somewhere deep below, the organ began to groan once more. But this time, Hester didn't flinch. She stood, quietly wrapped her shawl, and stepped out into the hallway. Each candle she passed flickered violently in her wake, as if resisting her presence. The house was trembling, not physically but emotionally, like a soul forced to relive its greatest shame. She descended to the great hall, where the notes grew louder. The organ's voice was no longer a melody, but a plea, a wordless cry soaked in sorrow. And when she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found Miss Furnivall already there, sitting stiffly in her usual chair, staring into the darkened hearth. The fire had gone out. The room was cold as the grave. "She's close tonight," the old woman said without turning. "You mean the child?" Miss Furnivall nodded slowly. "And her mother. They come together, sometimes." The old woman's voice was barely more than a whisper. "I told myself it was justice, that Maud had defied father. But I see her now, in my sleep, in the snow, in the firelight, and I know I was the coward. I watched the door close behind her. I didn't stop it." Hester moved closer. "You can make it right." The old woman looked up at her. Her eyes were like twin wells, dark, deep, and full of ghosts. She doesn't want justice, she wants her child back. And the child wants warmth, a home, a friend. Her lips quivered, but time doesn't give back what it takes. Before Hester could answer, a sudden sound cut through the room like a blade. The front door slammed open. Snow spilled onto the rug. The wind barreled in, bringing with it a low, guttural wail. Hester ran forward, forcing the door closed, latching it with trembling hands. But in that brief moment, she'd seen her. Maud, standing in the snow in a tattered gown, arms clutching the tiny figure of her child. Their eyes locked. No anger, no accusation. Just grief. The next day, Rosamond refused to eat. She sat in silence, staring out the nursery window, hands clenched in her lap. "She said we could come soon," she whispered when Hester pressed her. "Who said that, darling?" "The girl. She's waiting under the stairs." Hester's blood turned to ice. She went down later, alone, to the hallway below the organ loft. There, hidden behind a velvet curtain, was a narrow stairwell that led into a disused room beneath the chapel. The air there was stale, stifled, forgotten. She lit a candle and descended. At the bottom, she found a small wooden door. It groaned open. Inside, the walls were covered in frost. The floor was bare stone, cracked and uneven, and in the center, a child's shoe. It was old, the leather split, covered in mildew. She picked it up and turned it in her hand. Something was etched into the sole. One letter, M. That night, the dreams came. Not to Rosamond, to Hester. She was walking through snow, barefoot. Her breath fogged the air. A voice called out, a child's voice, beckoning. She turned and saw a shape in the distance, a girl, her hair matted with ice, her hands reaching. "Help her," the voice said. "She doesn't know where to go." Then she woke, sweating, breathless, weeping. The next day, she went to Miss Furnivall again. "You have to speak it, all of it, or they'll never stop." The old woman stared into the fire. "My father believed bloodlines were sacred. When Maud fell in love with the organist, a man with no title, no land, he was furious. He forbade it, threatened her, but she married him in secret, bore his child, a girl. She begged to come home, to be forgiven." Miss Furnivall's voice cracked. "He refused, and She closed her eyes. "I stood at the window and watched her walk away with her child into the snow. I told myself it was her fault, that she had made her bed, but that child, she had done nothing. Hester took her hand. "There's still a way to make peace." That evening, the sky turned violet with storm clouds. Snow fell in silence, thick and fast. Rosamond didn't speak all day. She sat on the edge of her bed, watching the door, her lips pale. She said, "It's tonight." "Who did?" Hester asked. "The girl. She said if we don't come, she'll find someone else." Hester held her close. Not tonight, not this child, not again. She dressed Rosamond in every layer she could find and sat by the door with a fire iron in hand. The hour crept toward midnight. The wind rose, and then came the footsteps. Soft, light. Just outside. Hester held her breath. The door handle turned, once, twice, then silence. Rosamond looked at her. "She's waiting." "No," Hester whispered. "You're not going." But the child only blinked. "She's cold." Then the candles blew out. All of them. Hester grabbed Rosamond and bolted. Down the stairs, through the great hall. The organ screamed, not played, screamed. Miss Furnivall sat in her chair, weeping openly now. "I see her," she sobbed. "I see them both. Forgive me. Please." The front door slammed open again. Snow and wind roared into the house. And standing in the threshold, Maud, pale as ash, and beside her, the child. Their eyes locked onto Rosamond, and for a moment everything stopped. Then Hester did something she didn't understand until later. She stepped forward. "I will raise her in your name," she whispered. "I will keep her warm. I will not forget you." Maud stared at her. Then slowly, very slowly, she smiled. It was faint, it was bitter, but it was there. She turned, took the child's hand, and walked back into the snow. The door slammed shut. The candles reignited. and the organ fell silent. The next morning dawned with an eerie quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick, untouched blanket of snow that smothered the grounds in white silence. Hester opened the nursery curtains, expecting to see the footprints again, those small, impossible trails leading nowhere. But the garden was pristine, clean, undisturbed. Rosamond slept peacefully, her chest rising and falling in a calm rhythm. No nightmares, no murmured conversations with unseen children, just rest. And for the first time in weeks, Hester allowed herself to exhale. Downstairs, the atmosphere had shifted. Mrs. Stark greeted her with a stiffness that felt almost like guilt. She didn't mention the night before, didn't ask if Hester had heard anything strange. She simply offered tea and left the room as quickly as she'd entered. Miss Furnivall, however, was different. She remained seated in her high-backed chair, her gaze no longer drifting to the shadows, but fixed, unblinking, on the hearth, where a new fire had been lit. She smiled, the old woman murmured as Hester passed. Maud smiled at the end. "Did you see it?" Hester paused. "Yes, I think I did." The old woman nodded slowly. "Then perhaps there's hope for me still." The words felt strange in Miss Furnivall's mouth. Foreign, like a language she hadn't spoken in years. Hester wasn't sure what hope could mean for a woman like her, but she said nothing, allowing silence to offer its own kind of grace. Over the following days, the house softened. The icy drafts that once crept under doors seemed to vanish. The organ remained silent, and though the snow continued to fall outside, its presence felt less oppressive, more natural, like weather, not warning. Hester took Rosamond outside once the skies cleared. They built a crooked snowman near the garden hedge, their laughter startling a flock of crows from the trees. The birds scattered into the clouds like ash. "Do you think she's watching?" Rosamond asked, brushing snow from her mittens. "Who?" "The girl, her mama." Hester thought for a moment. "Maybe, but I think they're happy now, wherever they are." Rosamond nodded solemnly, as if she understood something most adults never would. The peace lasted for several weeks, and then, one evening, a letter arrived. It bore a London seal, and the handwriting on the envelope was familiar. Stiff, formal, precise. Hester opened it with trembling hands. Her aunt was ill, gravely so, and she was asking for Hester to return. There was no one else to tend to her, no one else to manage her small lodgings and see her through what sounded like her final days. Hester folded the letter slowly. She would have to leave. That night, she told Miss Furnivall, "I don't want to abandon her," she said of Rosamond, "but I owe my aunt everything. She raised me." Miss Furnivall looked older than ever, her skin like parchment, her hands trembling slightly over her cane. "You should go," she said quietly. "The child is safe now. For the first time in years, the house has no need for ghosts." Hester nodded, though her heart twisted. She packed over the next 2 days. Rosamond helped, in her way, folding socks, counting buttons, placing small ribbons into Hester's trunk with exaggerated care. "You'll come back?" she asked. "If you need me," Hester said, crouching to meet her eyes. "I'll come the very moment you call." The morning of her departure was gray. The carriage waited at the gate, its horses pawing at the snow-packed ground. Hester hugged Rosamond tightly, kissed her forehead, and gave Agnes instructions she knew would be followed, even if Agnes said nothing. She turned to Miss Furnivall one last time. "I hope you find peace," she said. The old woman blinked slowly. "I see her less now. I think she's forgiven me. That's more than I deserve." And then Hester was gone. The road wound through the hills, the house shrinking behind her with each turn, but it never fully disappeared. Not really. She would carry Furnivall Manor with her, its echoes, its tragedies, its ghosts. Time passed. Her aunt's health stabilized, then declined, and finally faded altogether, like a candle guttering in its holder. Hester stayed, managing the estate, the funeral, the debts. Months became a year. Then another. She wrote letters to Furnivall, but none came back. And then, one autumn morning, a knock came to her door. It was Agnes. Older, her coat frayed, her hands stiff with arthritis, but her eyes still bright. "They're calling for you," she said. Hester didn't need to ask who. She returned that very night. The house had changed. It was quieter than she remembered, not in the way that signaled dread, but in the way old places grow tired. The stones had begun to settle. The woods had grown denser. Time had softened the estate's edges. Rosamond was nearly grown. She ran into Hester's arms at the door, nearly toppling her. "I've missed you," she whispered. "And I, you." Miss Furnivall was bedridden. She looked at Hester with milky eyes and whispered, "It's almost done." "What is?" "The penance." She died that evening, her last breath leaving her in a whisper. Maud. They buried her beside her father, against his wishes, if he could have spoken them. And for the first time in the house's long, sorrowful history, the wind did not rise that night. Years passed again. Hester stayed until Rosamond married, a kind man with gentle eyes who adored her fiercely. They moved away, started a life. Hester remained at Furnivall. She became its keeper, its watcher. And sometimes on the coldest nights when the snow fell just right, and the organ pipes breathed from the draughts of the past, she swore she could hear the faint echo of a lullaby. Two voices, singing as one, at peace. The first snow of December came early that year. Hester stood at the front window, watching the flakes descend in thick, slow spirals. They didn't feel ominous, not like before, not like the storm that had once howled for blood and memory, but they weren't ordinary either. There was a stillness in the snowfall, as if the sky itself had paused to listen. Behind her, the manor creaked in its familiar way, old bones shifting in their frame. The wind slipped beneath door frames, and the hearths crackled with quiet resolve. It was a house that had survived its own darkness, and now waited. She lit candles in each corridor not because she feared the dark, but because she respected it. The shadows in Furnivall Manor had been known to whisper when left unchecked. That evening, Rosamond returned. She arrived with her husband and their infant daughter bundled in wool and velvet. The child had blue eyes, eyes that seemed to look straight through Hester with the weight of generations. "She hasn't stopped staring at the gallery door," Rosamond said after settling in, "since we arrived." Hester smiled gently. "Children remember things we've taught ourselves to forget." They walked the halls together that night. Hester showed Rosamond the nursery, untouched since her departure. She showed her the doll, placed carefully in the crib. "Do you remember?" Hester asked. Rosamond nodded. "Only in dreams, but yes." They descended into silence. Later, as the fire burned low in the great room, Rosamond turned to her nurse and asked the question she'd never voiced as a child. Was it real? All of it? Hester didn't answer right away. She poured them both tea, sat across from her, and stared into the flames. "It was more than real," she said finally. "It was memory that refused to die." Rosamond shivered, not from cold, but recognition. That night, something returned. Not malevolent, not vengeful, but ancient. The child, Rosamond's baby, began to cry at midnight. Not a hungry cry, not a frightened one. A sorrowful wail. Deep, mournful, like a bell tolling in her tiny chest. Rosamond rushed to her side, scooping her from the cradle. "Shh, darling, shh." But the child kept crying, reaching one arm toward the corner of the room. The same corner where the snow-laced footprints had once appeared. Rosamond turned to Hester. "She sees her, doesn't she?" "I believe so." They stayed up together until dawn. No more footsteps, no voices. Just the child's slow return to sleep, and the distant feeling that someone, something, had passed through the room and gone. The next day, Hester took Rosamond into the gallery. Together, they unveiled the portraits once more, this time with intention. "Your great-grandmother," Hester said, nodding toward the woman with the cold eyes. "She broke the family in two. And Maud, she tried to heal it." They stood before Maud's painting, the one where she sat at the cradle with the unseen child. "I used to wonder what was in the cradle," Rosamond whispered. Hester reached out, brushing a finger along the painted cradle's edge. "I think it's not what, but who she hoped would return." Rosamond looked at her nurse. "I want to stay longer." "You should." That evening, the child laughed for the first time since arriving. A high, bell-like giggle that echoed through the rafters and made the crows in the trees take flight. It felt like an answer, a softening. That night, Hester dreamed again. She walked the corridor alone, candle in hand, following the faint scent of lavender and snow. The gallery door was open. Inside, the portraits had changed. Not in great ways, but in small details. The child in Maud's painting now had her face turned toward her mother. Her hand rested gently on the cradle, and Maud smiled. The change was so subtle, so quiet, it could have been imagined. But Hester knew. The house was remembering and forgiving. She awoke to the sound of the organ. Not a dirge this time. A lullaby, faint, warm, full of sorrow and sweetness. She rose, wrapped herself in a shawl, and walked down the hall. Rosamond stood in the nursery doorway, the baby sleeping on her shoulder. "You hear it too?" she asked. "I do. It doesn't feel wrong." "No," Hester said, stepping beside her. "It feels like a blessing." The notes faded into silence. The candle flickered once, then steadied. The house was resting. Spring came quickly. The snow melted from the eaves. Crocus flowers pushed through the thawing soil, and the woods behind the house, once silent and skeletal, rang with birdsong again. Rosamond's family stayed the entire season. They planted herbs in the old garden, hung fresh curtains in the nursery, painted over the wallpaper in the east wing. It was not erasure, it was revival. Hester watched them and thought, this is how curses break. Not with fire, not with exorcism, but with return, with love, with memory honored instead of buried. One afternoon, she found Rosamond in the gallery sketching in a journal. "What are you drawing?" Rosamond turned the pad toward her. It was Maud, reimagined, holding her child in full view. The cradle empty, the child alive. "I think it's what she wanted to see," Rosamond said. "It's beautiful." Hester placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've healed more than you know." That night, Hester walked the corridors alone one last time. No whispers, no shadows. Just the sound of floorboards and her own steady breath. She paused before the nursery, glanced inside. The doll sat in the crib, smiling. She left the door open. and went to sleep. The arrival of summer was like a second awakening for the old manor. The walls, once heavy with silence, now echoed with soft laughter and lullabies. Rosamond's daughter toddled through the halls with curious wonder, her tiny hands trailing along the wooden paneling like she was tracing something forgotten. There was no more organ music, no more howling winds that carried voices. But there was something else, something gentler. A sense of presence, no longer sinister, but ancestral, as if the house itself had become a memory, alive and observing. Hester, older now and slower in her movements, often sat by the kitchen window with a cup of tea, watching the child chase sunlight on the stone floor. She never spoke of what they'd seen, what they'd survived, but she felt it in her bones. Peace doesn't come to every house, but it had come here, slowly and at a cost. But it had come. One morning, Rosamond approached her with a box. "I found this in the attic," she said, placing it gently on the table. "I think it's time we open it." It was wooden, hand-carved, and sealed with rusted hinges. A faint scent of lavender still clung to it. Rosamond carefully pried the lid open. Inside, folded in yellowed linens, were letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to Maud. Some unopened, others worn from repeated reading. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, masculine. They read the first one aloud. "My dearest Maud, it has been 2 winters since they took you away. I write, though I know my letters may never reach you. I see her in every dream. I hear her laughter in the wind. I do not blame you for running. I blame myself for not running with you." They paused. Hester took a deep breath. "These weren't from her father," she said quietly. "No," Rosamond whispered, eyes wide. "They were from him, the man she loved." Letter after letter revealed the same longing, the same helplessness. A man cut off from the woman he loved and the child he'd never known. He'd tried to find them, tried to write, but Miss Grace Furnivall had intercepted it all. "I did not think them capable of such cruelty," Rosamond said, tears filling her eyes. "To rob her not only of her child's life, but of even the comfort of being missed. She died believing she was forgotten," Hester murmured, "but she wasn't." They placed the letters back in the box, but this time displayed it in the gallery beside Maud's portrait. The next day, a single white rose bloomed outside the window. Just one. No other bush nearby. They left it untouched. That summer, Rosamond hosted a gathering at the manor. A small one, just a few neighbors, some old friends, and a local historian curious about the estate. She gave a quiet tour of the gallery. She didn't speak of ghosts or organ music. She didn't mention snowstorms or spectral footprints. She simply told the story of a family, torn by silence, healed by truth. And when they passed Maud's portrait, Rosamond said, "She lost everything, and still loved." Later that evening, the historian approached Hester. "Furnivall Manor," he said, "has long been rumored to be cursed, but perhaps it was simply grieving." Hester smiled softly. Grief can be loud if you ignore it long enough. By the end of summer, the manor felt new. The paint no longer peeled. The stairwell didn't groan with each step. Even the windows seemed brighter, catching the light in ways Hester had never seen in her youth. She walked the halls slowly now, but without dread, without fear. One afternoon, she passed the nursery and paused. The crib was empty. The doll gone. She stepped inside. There, on the rocking chair, sat Rosamond's daughter, clutching the doll gently in her lap. "She wanted me to have it," the child said softly, not looking up. "Who did, darling?" "The Snow Lady," the girl whispered, brushing the doll's hair with her fingers. "She said I could take care of it now." Hester didn't reply. She simply walked to the window, looked out at the garden blooming with late summer flowers, and nodded. That night, Rosamond asked her, "Do you think she's finally at rest?" "I think," Hester replied, "that rest looks different for every soul. But I do believe she's no longer cold." They sat together, watching fireflies blink in the night beyond the glass. The child slept soundly. No more midnight cries, no more lullabies from nowhere. Only silence, blessed silence. The manor had become a sanctuary, not just for the living, but for the remembered. When autumn came again, Hester took to writing. She recorded the story, not as a ghost tale, but as a family history. She left out the spectral footprints and the haunted gallery, but she kept the truths of love denied, of forgiveness withheld, and of how healing sometimes requires generations. She titled it simply, "The House That Waited." One evening, as the wind began to whisper through the chimney and the candles flickered low, Hester stood one last time before Maud's portrait. She placed a pressed white rose beneath the frame, then turned away, and never looked back. Years passed. Seasons circled the manor like quiet sentinels. The winters grew gentler, the summers longer, and the wild roses that once refused to bloom now returned each spring without fail. The Furnivall name, once spoken with a hush, slowly reclaimed its place in local memory, not as a legend, but as a lesson. Hester, now well into her old age, lived in the East Wing, where the sun rose brightest in the mornings. Rosamond visited often, her daughter, now a wide-eyed girl of 7, running barefoot through the same halls her mother once crept down in terror. But the house was no longer haunted, not in the way it had been. There were still whispers, yes, but soft ones. Whispers like a mother humming to a child or a sister calling out in play. The kind of sounds that made you pause, but not tremble. It was as if the house had learned how to speak without screaming. One September morning, as leaves blushed crimson across the hills, Rosamond found Hester seated at the window, her lap blanketed in an unfinished shawl. "I've been dreaming again," Hester said, eyes fixed on the horizon. Rosamond pulled a chair beside her. "Of the manor?" "Of the child." Rosamond's breath caught. "Ruth?" "She was never named," Hester whispered, "but I call her Ruth." The girl had appeared in her dreams many times, always standing by the old cradle, one hand raised, not in fear but in greeting. Sometimes she would walk through the snow without leaving footprints. Other times she simply stood behind the gallery door, waiting. But this time she had said something. She told me, "Thank you." Rosamond laid her hand over Hester's. "She knows." That night, Rosamond walked the gallery alone. She hadn't done so in years. The portraits remained, dustless, untouched. Maud's was still the same, though somehow her eyes no longer seemed heavy. They looked outward now, not down. Beneath the frame sat the old box of letters, preserved in glass. Visitors now stopped to read them, some crying, some shaking their heads, but all left with something deeper than just curiosity. They left changed. In the far corner of the gallery, Rosamond paused. A new painting had been hung. It was a commissioned piece, a gift to the manor. It showed the young girl, Ruth, no longer alone in the snow. She was held, lifted by Maud, both of them bathed in soft winter light. There was no cradle, no storm, just reunion. Rosamond touched the frame, then turned to leave. As she did, a faint breeze brushed past her cheek, like a hand, or a kiss, or maybe just a sigh. She didn't flinch. Back in the nursery, her daughter stirred. "I saw her," the girl murmured, half asleep. "Who, sweetheart?" "The Snow Lady." Rosamond smiled. "What did she say?" "She said I can keep the doll." Rosamond tucked the blanket closer. "Then she must like you very much." "She's not sad anymore," the girl whispered. "She said she found her name." Rosamond sat for a long while in the rocking chair, watching her daughter drift into quiet dreams. The window was open just a crack, and the night air was cold but sweet. In the distance, the organ let out a single note. Clear, tender, then silence. By morning, the rosebush outside the nursery had bloomed again, though it was far past the season for such things. One single bloom. Always one. The years continued. Hester passed quietly one winter evening, her hands folded neatly, her shawl finally finished and wrapped around her shoulders. No candle extinguished itself, no ghostly wind tore through the manor. Just stillness, the kind that followed a prayer, not a scream. Rosamond buried her in the chapel yard beneath the oldest tree, where roots tangled like old fingers and the sun reached even in the shortest days. The headstone was simple. Hester Winterbourne, faithful keeper of memory. She listened when the house spoke. That spring, a second rosebush grew beside her grave. Unplanted, unbidden, Rosamond said nothing. She simply knelt and wept. Time moved forward as it always does. The manor was never sold. It became a place of quiet retreat, a house of rest for those who needed peace more than answers. No one ever saw another ghost. No one heard the organ again, but everyone who came felt something, a kind of watching, a warmth wrapped in sorrow, an echo of love that had once been buried beneath ice and silence and had finally found its voice. Rosamond, older now, kept the stories alive not as horror, but as legacy. She never spoke of terror, only of love broken and then mended, only of a house that had waited, and a child who had never been truly forgotten. The manor stood, steadfast as ever, beneath a sky streaked with gold and gray. Its chimneys no longer smoked daily, and ivy had begun its slow reclaiming of the outer stone. But inside, the walls still remembered. Rosamond walked the halls less now. Age had crept into her joints, and the once bold girl who had braved blizzards and ghosts now leaned gently on a cane carved from birchwood. Still, her eyes remained sharp, watchful, as if always listening for a whisper, a lullaby, or the creak of a door that hadn't been opened in years. Her daughter, grown into a woman, managed the household now. She too had heard stories, some whispered by her mother, others handed down in the silence between generations. She did not fear the gallery. She lit candles there in the winter and laid flowers beneath Maud's portrait in the spring. It was her way of saying, I remember. One October morning, Rosamond requested to be taken to the chapel. It had been years since she'd last gone. The path was still, the leaves crisp underfoot. Her daughter wheeled her down the gravel, past the hedges and the low stone wall. They reached the tree where Hester rested, its roots now pushing gently against the grave as if cradling it. Rosamond laid her hand on the cool headstone. "I dreamed of her again," she said softly. Her daughter didn't ask who. She already knew. She was standing at the foot of the cradle, Rosamond continued. But this time, she wasn't alone. A pause. Maud was with her. The wind stirred. Somewhere far off, a church bell chimed once, though there was no church for miles. "They never asked for revenge," Rosamond murmured, "only to be remembered. The chapel door creaked when opened, swollen slightly from damp. Inside, dust danced in the sunlight that filtered through stained glass. The altar was untouched. The pews, though empty, faced forward like loyal old friends. Rosamond stared at the place where the organ once stood. She could still hear it sometimes, if only in memory. That evening, they lit every candle in the gallery, not out of superstition, but reverence. Guests were invited, locals, travelers, historians who had written papers on Furnivall Manor's tragic past. They read the letters aloud, not as scandal, but as sorrow made visible, as testimony. A small plaque now rested below Maud's portrait, Maud Furnivall, 1806 to 1832. Beloved, betrayed, remembered. No storm silences love. The painting of the child in Maud's arms hung beside it, without explanation. Most who viewed it said nothing, but a few wept quietly, as if recognizing someone they'd never known. That night, as the house fell into sleep and the guests retired to their rooms, Rosamond walked alone one last time. She stopped before the nursery door. It was open. Inside, the crib was gone. In its place, a small armchair, a quilt folded neatly, and the old doll, still dressed in blue, seated upright, waiting. "I know," Rosamond whispered. "You're not lost." She turned, but not before glancing back one final time. In the hallway mirror, she saw her own reflection, and behind it, just for a flicker, a woman in gray, smiling softly, a child's hand resting in hers. Then nothing. Only candlelight. Only the hush of peace. Rosamond died that winter, her hand in her daughter's, her lips forming a name no one quite heard. They buried her beside Hester, beneath the tree that bloomed white each spring. The second headstone read Rosamond Winterbourne, 1824-1913. Truth-bearer, guardian of memory. From that day forward, the house never felt cold. Not in the way that chills, only in the way that wraps itself around you like history, layered and alive, neither cruel nor kind, just present. Visitors came and went. Some stayed the night. A few claimed to hear music in the floorboards or see movement beyond curtains. But no one ran. No one screamed. Because the story had changed. It was no longer about the terror of what hid in the snow or the fury of the organ. It had become something quieter. A love story, fractured and stitched together by time and truth. A tale of two sisters, one who obeyed, one who defied, and a child caught in their war. A nurse who protected with nothing but loyalty. A girl who remembered, and a house that had waited. For forgiveness. For names to be spoken again. For someone to light the candles and say, "This happened." The final words of Hester's manuscript rested now in a glass case near the entrance. Weathered but legible. Let no one believe that silence is safe. The unspoken festers, it turns hallways cold and shutters tight. But when we speak, when we name the forgotten, we open the door to peace, even for the dead. Beneath the page, a white rose pressed between the paper. It had not wilted, not in over a century.